In the United States, the North and the South developed very differently. Their economies, cultures, and political interests grew more and more different over time. Over time, these differences led to sectionalism. This meant that people began to feel more loyal to their part of their country than they did to their country as a whole. The sectional differences between the North and the South were nothing new. They had been there since the early days of the colonies. The North had developed as a trading region, and most people lived on small farms. The South had plantations and relied heavily on slave labor. Early on, slavery had existed all over the United States, but after a while, most northern states had moved away from the idea. They had even passed laws that allowed slaves to become free people. But this was not the case in the South, and after the invention of the cotton gin, the South became even more dependent upon slave labor. There were also political differences between these two sections of the country. Southerners tended to be Democratic Republicans. They agreed with the ideas of people like Thomas Jefferson. They did not think the government should get too involved in the lives of the people. Northerners were more likely to be Federalists. They were people who wanted to have a strong federal government. These two political parties, and these two sections of the country, continued to grow apart. The number of slaves in the South had grown over time. In fact, by the mid-1700s, there were more blacks than whites in most southern states. The growing number of slaves concerned many whites. They worried about the possibility of slave revolts. In 1822, a freed slave by the name of Denmark Vesey tried to organize a slave revolt in Charleston. It was not successful. Vesey and the other leaders of this plot were put on trial and hanged. This event made white Americans take steps to make sure something like this did not happen again. Laws called slave codes were tightened up. Slaves could no longer meet or assemble. Slaves could not learn to read or write. In 1831, another slave uprising took place in Virginia. It was called Nat Turner's Rebellion. People worried that maybe the slave populations were getting too big to control. Not everyone in the United States was in favor of slavery. There were some people who wanted to outlaw slavery once and for all. These people were called Abolitionists, and they were part of the Abolitionist movement. This movement was most popular in the North, but there were abolitionists everywhere, even in places like South Carolina. Plantation owners in the South did not like abolitionists. They saw them as a threat to their power. Sarah and Angelina Grimke were abolitionists who lived in South Carolina, and they were forced to leave the state. While the abolitionist movement was popular in the North, most people did not take part in it. Most people thought slavery was part of life in America, and they didn't care one way or another about it. But there were some people who cared very much about stopping slavery in America. William Lloyd Garrison was a newspaper publisher. He started a newspaper that was against slavery. It was called The Liberator. Most mailmen in the South made sure his newspaper did not spread, but there were people who read it in the North. Other people who were against slavery helped run the Underground Railroad, but it had little impact in South Carolina. South Carolina was too far from any free states. It was very difficult for slaves in South Carolina to be able to successfully make it all the way to the North without being caught along the way. Abolitionists were not very well liked by most Southerners. Their actions to end slavery only added to the tensions between the North and the South during this time.